The DPS meta in ESO has changed forever, and with the PTS cycle finally coming to a stable end, we finally understand to some degree how the meta is changing and what the top DPS builds for update 46 are going to look like. In this video, I'm going to let you know what has changed and what's good now, as well as go over the most common content, parse dummy, and buff DD setups that we'll see in raid comps for Season of the Worm Cult. Now, to better understand the current outlook on DPS builds, let's start by discussing the most relevant changes to damage dealing that we've seen throughout the PTS cycle. When all of this garbage started, anybody who had played the game in the last year knew that Herald of the Tome was going to be broken, and yet maybe the craziest change was the buff to Fatecarver in the week 1 cycle. They increased the damage of Fatecarver by 8% and tried to balance that by increasing the cost by 40%. Now, in my opinion, the cost change was simply annoying and not impactful. With the right combination of comp and build changes, Fatecarver is still going to be usable, and simply with a more pronounced resource drain, so this low resource meta that we've had since 2021 just becomes a bit more annoying. It's lame in my opinion, but that's besides the point. Outside of Fatecarver, we knew Herald of the Tome would be really good because the pen from Splintered Secrets and the crit damage from Implacable Outcome. Yet, instead of balancing these advantages, Splintered Secrets was buffed, now providing nearly 1,000 extra pen for simply slotting Fatecarver in Flail. These changes make Herald of the Tome an absolute must on every DD next patch. Fun, right? Later into the PTS cycle, they attempted to balance this by making channeled abilities like Fatecarver and Radiant Oppression direct damage abilities, as opposed to AoE, which kind of worked, but not as well as you might think, as we'll see in the builds later on. Outside of these rather annoying changes, the rest are actually kind of decent. The second big change involves the assassination tree from the Nightblade. Grim Focus received a very interesting change, now stacking up to 10 times rather than 5, but still allowing the bow proc to be fired at 5 stacks. Now, the bow proc isn't really the important part here. The passive weapon and spell damage that we got from this ability now also stacks 10 times, but at 40 per stack with Relentless Focus, resulting in 400 total weapon and spell damage passively, regardless of the slotted bar. The same as last patch, but we can now apply this buff to Fatecarver. The Assassination Tree also receives some crazy changes to passives, the first of which is Master Assassin. This ability now increases our critical chance by 8.8% against enemies that you flank, rather than giving us extra penetration. Likewise, the Pressure Points passive increases our crit chance by 2.5%, up from 2. These changes, especially when combined with Highland Sentinel, have created an insane amount of total crit chance that we can have, leaving us with nearly 90% crit chance with the Thief, or still around the typical 80% with the Apprentice Mundus. These passives in combination with Relentless Focus makes the Assassination Tree an absolute must-have in this new season. Now, the third skill tree is finally where some flexibility and ambiguity come into play. While Herald of the Tome and Assassination are two must-have trees no matter what, the option for our third DPS tree can depend either on group comp or playstyle. I tested pretty much every relevant damage tree and was shocked at how close the results were for Fatecarver builds. Now, to reiterate, I've done these tests assuming that Fatecarver will be the meta in content, which I believe will be true in the vast majority of trial scenarios, with my highest Fatecarver parse reaching around 165k, compared to the highest single target parses I've seen so far reaching around 180. Now, that single target parse I'm mentioning was with Power Overload, and we'll take a look at this parse later, but that skill adds a ton of DPS, 10k in fact, and it's an ultimate that's really only usable in Vast, so it's safe to say that Fatecarver builds are performing roughly 5 to maybe 10k lower than the strongest pure single target setups, which means Fatecarver is just going to be better for any fight that requires any sort of cleave, or even for trash pulls in general. And these fight types encompass the vast majority of content. So as far as my actual tests go, Gravelord seems to be in the worst shape, coming in at 153k, but this is the only true outlier, as we then hit 157k with Daedric Summoning, 158k with Animal Companions, 160k with Ardent Flame, 160k with Storm Calling, and then the more obvious meta choices, both Aedric Spear and Dawn's Wrath, were nearly tied at 165k, with Dawn's Wrath squeaking out ahead by a couple hundred DPS. Again, all of these trees paired with Herald of the Tome and Assassination. I think Dawn's Wrath will be the best tree for the dummy setup with Fatecarver, but Aedric Spear is going to be much better in content, mostly due to the Piercing Spear passive, which will give us an extra 10% critical damage. Pairing Herald of the Tome, Assassination, and Aedric Spear allows us to drop Alkosh with a few small comp tweaks and to drop both Sax and EC, opting for just these skill trees plus Lucent Echoes to hit the crit cap. It's truly insane how much this has changed raid comps and how much simpler they've become. Now, with so much free space opening up for the support, traditional buff DD setups like Zenkosh, EC Crow, or MK Sork are falling out of relevancy, so let's talk about what the raid responsibilities of damage dealers will look like in Update 46. There are a few ways that this could work out, but the main point is that running 2 buff sets is fully dead. I mean, pairing 2 buff sets historically, with the exception of Zenkosh, has always been a bit suboptimal. For example, the EC MK Crow is not a build setup that's worth running, because nuking one player's DPS this heavily is usually enough of an individual damage loss to outweigh the group's DPS gain. And that concept is going to carry heavily into Update 46. We no longer need EC or Alkosh, so that will only leave Zen, MK, and then potentially a Slayer set like War Machine to fall to the DDs. When we run any of these setups, we will only place 1 buff set on a DD at a time, and the only set that feels truly necessary to slot on a damage dealer is Zen. Now, in order to run Zen, we likely have to use Ardent Flame, which will give us access to strong dots and strong status effect passes to help maintain Zen, as well as Engulfing Flames, which is a buff skill considered necessary in an optimized group. Now, in my opinion, you'll be best off pairing Ardent Flame with Herald of the Tome and Assassination, and then you'll simply slot Fighting Finesse to make up for the rest of the crit damage that you'll be missing by not using the Adric Spear tree. There are other ways to make up for this though, and here I'll turn your attention to a log from Syndicate, a team currently competing for World's First in the race for the new trial Ossian Cage, where we can take a look at their buff DD's thought process. Now, this player does drop Herald of the Tome for the Gravelord tree, which gives a bunch of penetration but no crit damage bonus, so in turn this team is running Sax for Major Force. And frankly, this comp still looks like it's in a state of testing, since some players are running Adric Spear but others are in Gravelord, Dawn's Wrath, and some other mixed trees as well. There are some cool theories as to why. I mean, the second and most difficult boss of the trial becomes the most difficult in its execute phase, so running a strong execute like Killer's Blade or Radiant Oppression, or even getting a strong passive like Death Knell, which increases your crit chance by a ton to targets under 33% health, would be extremely helpful in making this phase very short. But to do this, you have to sacrifice support set slots, which, I mean, if you have the free space, who cares, right? So, I mean, we'll dive heavily into the implications of the buff DD setups and exactly who will be running what for all players in the next video, where I discussed a new raid comp for Update 46. But for now, let's take a deeper look into my proposed buff DD setup. If you do have Slayer DDs, they'll simply run War Machine plus Deadly with the same bar setup as everybody else, but the Zen DD will need to make some changes. For gear, since we don't have Alkosh, the only medium armor trial set that generically makes sense to me is Onsel. Onsel is a solid one-size-fits-all set that's good for any scenario, and the extra line of pen could be the difference between hitting and not hitting pen cap without Alkosh in Update 46. If pen isn't a concern though, you could consider Coral Riptide if you can sustain it properly, or something like Reli or Null Arca for pure single target fights. We'd of course pair these 5 pieces with Zen, the Velothir Mage's Amulet, either the VMA Greatsword or VMA Inferno depending on the cleave demand of a fight, and then either 1-piece Slimecraw if we are at pen cap, or 1-piece Valken if we are not. For skills, maintaining Zen actually requires fewer dots than ever before. Historically, we only had the combustion passive on the DK, which increased our chance to apply the burning and poison status effects by 40%. Now, that passive has been nerfed to 33%, but if we combine this with the Herald of the Tome tree, we gain access to the Psychic Lesion passive. And so when we combine Psychic Lesion, Combustion, and our charged weapon trait, we can rely on burning and poison to proc Zen as consistently as any other actual skill. So this means that we would only need to slot 3 legitimate damage over time abilities, and for Zen, we can simply use Trap, Venomous Claw, which will also proc poison more often, and Engulfing Flames, which will add more burning procs as well. So after this, we just need to make sure that we are actually proccing our important passives. So we need to slot an Assassination ability on the front bar, and we also need to make sure that we are creating and consuming Crux for a crit damage passive. To create Crux, we'll use Writhing Runeblades as our primary spammable, Tentacular Dread to consume the Crux, and this ability also gives us a pretty large DPS increase with Abyssal Ink, and then we will slot Killer's Blade, Merciless Resolve, and Incap on the front bar for both our Assassination passives, and simply for those skills' raw damage, though we will only use Incap at the end of a fight when we can't get a Languid back. To finish the front bar, we will slot Molten Whip for the passive weapon and spell damage, but also to use when we hit 3 stacks of Seething Fury for a little bit of extra damage. On the back bar, we'll slot our Zen dots, Claw, Engulfing, and Trap, and then we will also run Flames of Oblivion in either Stampede or Wall, depending on the arena weapon of choice. and this will leave one flex slot for either a damage or survivability oriented skill of your choice, finishing off with Languid Eye as our primary ultimate. The only other consideration is CP, where we would simply run Deadly Aim, Master at Arms, and Wrathful Strikes or Exploiter to buff our highest sources of DPS, or Fighting Finesse when necessary to hit the crit cap. Our parse DD builds will be much simpler. Now I want to go over two main builds here, one of which is the more common Fatecarver setup for content, and the other being a showcase of a straight single target oriented build that can pump out 180k DPS on the dummy. So starting with the Fatecarver setup, we kind of need to differentiate between this build's single target and AoE setups as well. When you're in content, you can't switch morphs of abilities, right? So you have to spec for the trial as a whole in that sense. When running Fatecarver, you'll always want to run Cephaliarch's Flail. And when not running Fatecarver, the other morph Tentacular Dread is much more preferable. But in trial content, your overall trial time is more often determined by your trash pulls, and Fatecarver is simply a must for trash. And even for actual boss fights, Rockgrove is a great example here. Fatecarver will be the uncontested meta for Oaks and Boss Save, but a more single target oriented build that drops Fatecarver will be a bit better for Zalvaka. Now, all of this to say, our gear setup will vary depending on whether we need a bit more single target or AoE damage in this setup. As a funny note, on the dummy at least, I had far less sustain issues by speccing into Magicka and running Ghastly Eyeball more often than not, but this difference is pretty minimal. Ultimately, the concept of mag and stam specs is fully dead in update 46. So simply spec into whichever max resource is easier to sustain. Now with that, for the dummy, which is a single target type fight, I slotted Null Arca with Highland Sentinel, the Velathier Mage's Amulet, the VMA Greatsword, and One Piece Slime Crop. If you don't like Highland Sentinel, you can run Deadly Strikes instead, and I would run Deadly in content far more than I would Highland to be honest, but Highland is just too good to not run on the dummy, or frankly any fight where you can maintain the stacks pretty well. Another set worth keeping our eye on for now as well is a craftable from the new zone Solstice called Tideborn Windstalker, which gives a line of pen and increases our direct damage by 12%. This will buff Fatecarver with that ability now again being a direct damage skill. Null Arca is our strongest single target set for this build, but in content you can replace it like something with Onsol or even Coral Riptide if you can sustain that set. But do be warned, sustaining Riptide with the cost increase has gotten extremely difficult. Now our skill setup depends on what tree you pair with Assassination and Herald of the Tome. With these two trees alone, there are a couple of must-have skills. We will obviously run Flail and Fatecarver, as well as Banner on both bars to increase our damage and give us free Crux. As a note, your class mastery signature script is dependent on your base class, so choosing Arcanist is still very important. We will then slot Cloak for its raw DPS and its increased chance to proc our enchantments. Usually we rely on our light attacks to do this, but being in a 5-second channel prevents us from light attacking frequently, so we have Cloak to proc these while still being in beam. We do have a flex slot on the front bar, which I have filled generically with Barbed Trap, the strongest non-class option here, and then we run Incap on the front bar to give us our Assassination passive on the front bar. Moving on to our back bar, we will then slot Relentless Focus, which we will never use but just passively benefit from, then Inspired Scholarship to proc Crux, Fulminating Rune as a strong flex dot with a very important group synergy, as well as Banner with Languid Eye as our ultimate of choice. Now this bar setup changes very slightly depending on what we pick for our third tree. In content, the most common choice will be Adric's Spear. This tree is one of our strongest options purely for the Burning Light passive, which will do around 7k DPS on its own. This is worth more than any individual ability in our toolkit outside of Fatecarver and Languid Eye, so it effectively acts as a free dot that we never have to slot or cast. It doesn't even change our bar setup, we pretty much just pick the tree and get a free massive DPS increase. If we want to benefit from the Piercing Spear passive though for the extra crit damage and content, we will simply slot Blazing Spear over Barbed Trap and rarely if ever cast the ability. Now because I did the testing, I'll briefly go over what I used for each skill tree that I did test for the third option. In the Gravelord tree, I slotted Detonating Siphon on the front bar to activate our Gravelord passives, and for the free 3% DPS increase Siphon gives for being slotted to hit 153k. In the Daedric Summoning tree, I slotted the Twilight Tormentor over Trap on the front bar and Fulminating on the back bar to hit 157k. In the Animal Companions tree, I slotted Deep Fissure on the front bar in place of Trap, as well as the Wild Guardian ultimate on both bars to hit 158k. In the Ardent Flame tree, I slotted Molten Whip over Trap on on the front bar and Flames of Oblivion over Fulminating Rune on the back bar to hit 160k. In the Storm Calling tree, I slotted Hurricane on the back bar and then slotted Inner Light on the front bar, though this was very early into my testing and I probably should have used Trap over Inner Light here, but we still hit 160k, making this the third strongest option, mainly due to the Amplitude passive, which increases our damage by up to 10% to targets at 100% health. And that damage buff decreases as a target's health gets lower, losing its value fully when a target reaches 50% health. It's just a bit of front-end burst. Finally, in Dawn's Wrath, I used Radiant Oppression over Barbed Trap and Solar Barrage over Fulminating Rune to hit my highest parse at 165k. Finally, I want to leave you with this pure 180k single target build that I've seen showcased by Zweifas and Alduin. Now, this is Zweifas's parse that we're taking a look at here, and as a note, I cannot stress enough, I really don't think that this setup will be worth running in content for the most part, just because of how strong Fatecarver's AoE utility truly is. Now, that said, it's important to know about this setup because we will likely see this build, or at the very least, some elements of it pop up here and there situationally. It truly will be months before we have a solid understanding of what trial and fight-specific metas look like, and I'm willing to bet that this build will inspire some comp ideas and changes. So with that, the gear setup is very simple, just Null Arca, Highland, Selene, and the VMA Greatsword. Remember, for single target, if we can't run Highland, we will probably just run Tideborn with how direct damage oriented this setup is. We will combine the Herald of the Tome, Assassination, and Storm Calling trees for this setup, using Surprise Attack as our primary spammable. Now, in order to proc the Herald of the Tome passive, we need to be generating and consuming Crux, which is where Banner comes into play. We will get a Crux from Banner every 5 seconds, and then use Tentacular Dread for the 11% increase in DPS every 20 seconds, which means that we should be activating this passive once every 5 seconds with a good rotation. Tentacular Dread is also just insane. I mean, an 11% increase in DPS is simply massive. Then most of our actual single target damage done will come from the Nightblade's burst abilities. We will use Surprise Attack as our primary spammable, Killer's Blade in place of Surprise Attack below 33% target's health, and then our bow proc Merciless Resolve. Now, this skill is interesting. Rather than using it at 5 stacks, we will now let it build to 10 stacks and fire it there, since we can now passively benefit from the increased weapon and spell damage at 5 stacks at all times. Incap will be our primary ult, but on the back bar, we will start with Power Overload. I really do hate this ultimate, but it is so strong. We can cast it at 500 at the beginning of a fight and use it all the way to 0, with this ult being worth 10k DPS now instead of just 5k on the Sorc historically. Thanks to all of the passive buffs brought with subclassing and the fact that we're now using all 500 of the ultimate instead of just Power Overload into Atro at 180. For actual backbar abilities, we will slot Stampede to proc the VMA Greatsword's effects, Scholarship, Trap, and Hurricane as strong dots, and then of course Banner so that it doesn't deactivate on bar swap. For our champion points, we will run Wrathful, Deadly, Master, and Exploiter, slotting Fighting Finesse in content where we might be under the crit cap when opting to drop sets like EC and Sax. In Update 46, the meta is becoming more and more clear, and I'm sure that the next thing everyone's looking for is a detailed build guide on exactly how to play these new specs. This video and so much more is on the way. But first, I have a full video detailing the new 12-man raid comp coming next week, so if you aren't seeing this video already pop up, make sure that you subscribe to the channel so that you can be among the first to see the way that ESO is changing forever.